Hi, everyone. My name is Heather Doyle. I'm the Director of Special Education here at Mount Lebanon School District, and I am going to be talking to you all today about our supports that we have in place for students that focus on social, emotional, and behavioral well-being or health. So we're focusing specifically on those supports that will help our students as they're returning to school during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're still in that process of returning to school because even though we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel with the testing, with more, vaccine distribution, and we've learned a lot in terms of mitigating measures, we're still in the midst of the pandemic. So that's what we're focusing on today, the social, emotional, and behavioral health piece, those supports that we have in place here in the district. So I'm going to move to the next slide. And if I seem a little awkward doing this, it's because it is a little bit awkward presenting to a screen and recording it with there being no audience. So I apologize in advance. Okay, so just to provide some background, it's been at this point over a year that we've been in this pandemic, and at this point last year, we were really just trying to come to grips with how to educate students remotely, completely remotely, where we had no students in the building. And then once we also were preparing to return to school and to for the next school year, for this school year. So in the district in May and June of 2020, we were charged with the task of developing a recovery plan to prepare our students for the return to school after and during the COVID-19 pandemic. There were subcommittees that were created to help develop this recovery plan. And the subcommittees included teachers, support staff, administrators, also parents were included on those subcommittees to develop the recovery plan. The subcommittee that I was co-chair of, along with Dr. Melissa Nelson, the principal at Washington Elementary, was the Social, Emotional, Behavioral, and Physical Health subcommittee. And our subcommittee looked at those aspects of health for both our students and for our employees. Today, we're really focusing on social, emotional, and behavioral support. So that's the piece that we're focusing on of that subcommittee work. We really met, I couldn't tell you how many times we met in May and June to develop our plan. And we had it ready by, I believe it was June 18th was our date that we needed to have the plan ready, and that was available to the public on June 18th. It's still on our website. It's a plan that we implemented through the summer, and we're still implementing during the school year. So moving on to our goals. The plan that's available on our website to view, there's goal statements. It's organized and using a template so that all the subcommittees had a similar organization of what they hope to accomplish. But the goal of our subcommittee that focused on student social, emotional, and behavioral health was Mount Lebanon School District will have in place a system of social, emotional, and behavioral health supports to allow for students to successfully re-engage in the learning process and actively participate in their education throughout the course of a school year after a crisis. Now, the wording here says after a crisis. However, I would say that we're still in the pandemic. It's different. Now we're in a different stage than we were, but but after a crisis is going to be a different time frame for different individuals and for different students. So this work, even though we were focused on this year, it's going to be continuing. These supports will continue to be in place for our students for years to come, because that's what's needed. And recovery, there isn't a defined start and end time. It's recovery happens for individuals, at their own pace. So moving on to the next slide. After that goal, the objective that really encapsulates what I'm going to be discussing today our objective was to create a system of tiered supports for students to minimize social, emotional, and behavioral barriers to learning after a crisis. And that's what this presentation's all about, are tiered supports that are available to students that minimize those barriers, those social, emotional, and behavioral health barriers. And you might be asking yourself what a system of tiered supports is, or what that means, because you'll hear me say that a lot over the next 25 to 30 minutes. But a system of tiered supports, it's a framework that provides increasing levels of support to students who need it. So we have 3 tiers to that system of tiered supports. We have our first tier, which is our foundation, and our foundational supports are available to all students. So we have at that foundation, we have the majority of our students being met by those universal supports. That's the term that we use for that first tier. They're universal supports. We want most of our students, and when I say most, I'm meaning around 80% of our students, to have their needs met through those universal supports. And then we have a second tier, which provides more targeted support. And the targeted supports are at the tier 2 level, and approximately 10 to 15% of students may fit into that tier of service or supports. And then at that very top of the pyramid is our intensive level of support. And those supports are more individualized, and about 1 to 5% of students would likely fit into that tier. And again, those percentages are really just approximations. There's no cap. It's really just based on what students need. And I say, so here in this slide, like a pyramid is the visual that's typically used for these systems of tiered supports. So I'm going to show you a pyramid that's really a prototype that's often used when we're talking about tiered supports. So here's the pyramid, and it makes me laugh because I've seen so many of these pyramids, and we use this visual a lot, but we use it a lot because it's very useful. So sometimes I get tired of looking at the pyramid, but it is a very useful visual when we're talking about tiered supports. And this one especially I like because you can see that universal level of support where it says all students receive those supports. So and you'll see that the proportion there is quite accurate. It's not quite 80%, but it's much larger than the yellow, the targeted, and the red, the intensive. But that's the majority of our students. Their needs are being met through that foundational level, that universal level of support. And a lot of those things included in that universal level of support are really preventative in nature, because we want our students to have the skills and supports they need so that they are able to learn and grow and succeed in school and beyond. And then building upon that, we have the targeted level of support, which involves more small group. It's just a bit more intensive to meet the students' needs that need something a little bit more than what's provided to everyone. So that targeted level of support is provided in addition to the universal supports. And that's another reason why these like layered pyramids are so helpful, when such a helpful visual when we're talking about tiered supports, because they build upon each other. And students receive the universal supports, and then they get the targeted supports in addition to that. And then when we're at the intensive level, at the very top, that red section where we have, it goes from all in the green, universal, to some in targeted, and then to few up in the intensive level. But they receive those supports in the targeted and universal levels tiers, in addition to the intensive tier, the tier 3. So tier 1 universal, that's at the bottom. Tier 2 targeted, that's in the middle, and that's some individuals receive that. And then few is at the top, and that's tier 3 intensive. So this is just an example pyramid. And then moving on to the next slide, this is our pyramid that we used. And we wanted to provide a visual so that someone could see this pyramid, and they had, you know, the information included within it to know what are tier 1 supports and what tier 2 supports are being provided, like what's included in those tiers. So we couldn't get quite as fancy with the coloring and those things, but there's still the pyramids and there's the tiers. And you'll see here, this is a bit difficult to read on a slide presentation, but we're going to go through each tier of these supports, starting with tier 1, the universal level. And that's why it's circled on this next slide. So tier 1, the universal level, that's where we're starting, at the foundation, the things that everybody gets. So tier 1, universal supports for all students. The advanced communication, written and visual, videos, all of those things that help to prepare our students and their families for changes, for what school is going to look like. These are the communications that have been provided throughout the school year. Now, what's interesting to think about now is when we initially put this plan in place in May and June, and we were coming up with these tiers of supports, we were thinking more along the lines of like the start of school. And we weren't quite sure what that would look like or what the rest of the year would look like. But we've had to do this several times throughout the year because we've had, you know, various modes of instruction at different points of the year. I think for elementary, like March 15th, when we had all of our kids back in school, that was actually the first day of school, meaning like the 6th transition back to school in a different format. So that's required a lot of communication and the visuals. Just knowing the different routine changes, just even getting into the buildings, like the different doors that you come through, wearing a mask, the physical distancing, all of those kinds of things that we've tried to the best of our ability to provide advanced communication regarding those changes and what to expect when you come back to school for our students. We've also embedded psychoeducational and social-emotional learning throughout the school year to address things like self-care and self-management skills. Being a student it's different than it was. What it means to be a student is different than what it meant 14 months ago. There are different distractions. There are different expectations. And it's also, for some students, it may be more stressful and it may require different types of self-care compared to what was needed 14 months ago. I know for me, when we first started conducting most of our meetings through Google Meet, I remember just being so exhausted. It's still exhausting, but it's you get accustomed to it. But I remember just being so exhausted from going from Zoom meeting or Google meeting, these video conferences, from one after the other. Like by the end of the day, it was a lot. And what that taught me was that I really needed to take time away from the screen, and not schedule meetings back to back to back, day after day after day. And our students, we have to teach them to employ those strategies because they're still learning about self-monitoring. They're still learning what they need to do to take care of themselves. And we're all here to help them learn those skills. Developing the scripted lessons related to school reentry using the psychological first aid for schools, listen, protect, connect, model, and teach framework. That was, those lessons were developed by our school counselors and school psychologists. They worked very diligently on creating those scripted lessons. And they're scripted so that our teachers, we had our teachers delivering those at the start of the school year and, throughout the school year. But we wanted those to be scripted and using the expertise of our school counselors and school psychologists, so that our teachers were in a place that they were empowered with the intervention and the lessons to provide to our students. And it allowed us to provide all of our students with this content, and quickly, rather than having to wait for the school counselor or school psychologist, or for a group of people, for a school psychologist or school counselor to get to them to provide that content. And it also helped for our students to develop those relationships with teachers, having them implement the Listen, Protect, Connect, Model, and Teach framework. And some additional supports under Tier 1 include, we trained our Encore and content teachers for the scripted delivery of that psychological first aid for schools. We had some additional days at the start of school set aside for in-service and professional development. That's what we focused on, in addition to all the health related trainings that needed to be provided. So that was a huge focus for us at the start of the school year. Also, school counselors, providing access in all buildings for all students to our school counselors. We're very fortunate in this district that we have school counselors available in all of our buildings, and they're there for all students whenever they're needed. Communicating to our families about the resources that are available through various modes of communication, because some of us we get our information through a newsletter, some emails better, some the website, sometimes it's through through social media, but we wanted to get those resources out to families. This is just an overview of the psychological first aid for schools model, the Listen, Protect, Connect, Model, and Teach framework. The psychological first aid was really a framework that was initially for first responders when they were when they were responding to a crisis. They were trained in psychological first aid, but it's since been adapted for schools, and our teachers have been trained in this model, in the Listen, Protect, Connect model and teach framework. And going through this, you can see like that this really helps to develop, it provides teachers with the content to and to let students know that they can rely on them and help them to feel protected. The listening piece is what I consider to be, it's foundational to this and to everything that we do when it comes to helping, being in a helping profession. Um, you need to listen to hear what students say and what they need. Helping them feel protected by continuing to listen to concerns and talk to them about what's being done to keep them safe in the community and in school. And reassuring them that we are all working together to keep them safe. Connecting and reaching out to students regularly, communicating with other people in students' lives, including their parents and grandparents. Our teachers have been doing that. Restoring clubs and activities to the greatest extent that possible, because those activities are so important when it comes to that school connectedness. And the research shows how vital that is for students, especially those vulnerable students. And during vulnerable times like this, that connection to school makes a huge difference. Modeling, being mindful of verbal and nonverbal cues, committing to your own self-care. So we have been emphasizing this with our faculty and our employees throughout the pandemic, that the self-care is important, and you have to understand what you need as a person so that you're in a place where you can help others. And also acknowledging the difficulty of the situation and cutting yourself some slack too, if you're not always operating at optimum level. And teaching, helping students to reach and achieve small goals. So I think sometimes, we look at, if we have like a long way to go with something, or we want to achieve something, sometimes if it's too big of a goal, it just seems insurmountable. But if we're able to focus on just getting through the class or the day, or getting done with a certain assignment, helping kids focus on those small goals, then that success builds upon itself. And sometimes that's all the momentum you need, is just to get that ball rolling with accomplishing one goal. Then it seems much easier to accomplish something more. So that's just an overview of the Listen, Protect, Connect, Model, and Teach and the psychological first aid framework. And with that, we went through all of the Tier 1 supports. So we're moving on to Tier 2. These are the targeted level of supports. And our middle of our pyramid. Tier 2, we are increasing in the school family contact. So increasing, also it's more likely that we have school counselors being involved, people outside of the classroom. So Tier 1, what's available to all students, a lot of that is kind of classroom based, and the contact is classroom based because we have teachers who are in contact with students. Now that we're getting to Tier 2, we have students who need more targeted support. We have school counselors in the building and other individuals who can help provide that more targeted support. And also, if we have students who are more vulnerable and we have knowledge that they are more vulnerable, students that are going through school, some kind of school refusal or school anxiety coming back to school, any kind of personal loss, we forget how close to home this pandemic has hit for many of us. And in terms of people being ill from COVID-19, and also personal loss when it comes to not being able to see family. And depending on every family situation, that looks a little different, and depending on every student, that affects them differently. So we have to be cognizant of how that's impacting our students, that loss piece, because loss is different for each of our students, and that's certainly could make them be in greater need of more targeted support. Also providing short-term counseling to students in groups. So also in the targeted support level tier, we're looking at group-based services, so small groups instead of like whole classroom. Utilizing the student assistance program. That's something that we have in place in all 10 of our buildings. So that referral process for SAP, that's something we may want to employ at this point in Tier 2. Also providing monitoring and mentoring. As we go up in the tiers, there's more monitoring that occurs. And by monitoring, I'm meaning checking in with students, keeping track of how they're doing. And we may be looking more specifically at certain aspects of student well-being or their behavior, or it's just more frequent contact. And also the mentoring piece. So there would be more mentoring, perhaps from a school counselor, also from the teacher, more individualized at this level. The student assistance program, this is something that's been in place in all of our 10 buildings for several years now. It did start out at the secondary level here at Mount Lebanon, but over the past, I believe, 3 years, it's expanded to the elementary, starting at certain buildings, and then now I think it was last year they started all 10 buildings. So what SAP is, or the Student Assistance Program, it's a systematic team process that's used to mobilize school resources to remove barriers to learning. And the barriers could include alcohol, tobacco, drugs, mental health issues, anything that's considered a barrier to learning. That's what SAP focuses on. We partner with the Allegheny Children's Initiative for our SAP program. They attend all of our SAP meetings at the buildings, and they provide training to our SAP teams at the building level. And the members of those teams, typically, it's a little different depending on the building, but they typically include a school counselor, a principal or an administrator, school psychologist, teachers, and they work together to provide assistance to students, and assistance that is tailored to meet their needs. Students can be referred to SAP through school personnel, but also through parents and guardians, peers, and self-referral. The Student Assistance Program in Pennsylvania has actually been in place since 1985 school year. I'm from Ohio, and I moved here 3 years ago to take this position in Mount Lebanon in Pennsylvania, and I was really impressed with the SAP program since it was new to me when I came here 3 years ago. But also impressed that our district has made that a priority to expand it beyond the secondary level into all of our 10 buildings. Now we're moving on to Tier 3. So this is our most intensive level of support, and it's at the very top of our pyramid. As a reminder, these supports are provided they're supplemental in nature. There's no like supplanting. So you don't go to tier 3 and tier 3 takes the place of tier 2. It builds upon itself. So that's why that pyramid that we see all the time is a very good visual for this tiered system of support. So we'll move on to tier 3. And this is all the information that we included in our pyramid in the visual here, but it will be a little easier to read now that it's on a big slide instead of confined to just that tippy top of the pyramid. So at the intensive level of supports, tier 3, we're increasing the frequency of school-family contact for our vulnerable students. We're also providing more individualized supports. So at this level, we're looking at individual counseling at the short-term level from our school counselors. We also have school social workers who get involved at this level. We have 2 school social workers who work in the district. They work primarily with our students who have special needs related to social, emotional, and behavioral concerns. And they provide this intensive individualized support to those students. So they come into play at this level. Also, utilizing the SAP referral process, if that hadn't been done previously in tier 2, we would look at that for tier 3. Attendance improvement family meetings. That again is we're coming up with an individualized plan at that attendance meeting to address whatever barriers exist for that student when it comes to accessing their education. Collaborating with school psychologists is something else that we often do at tier 3. School psychologists are experts when it comes to school-based mental health, assessments, screening, also creating individualized intervention plans for students who need this intensive level of support. So their expertise is really vital at this level. Completing screenings and assessments at the intensive level of support. That's also critical because oftentimes we want to make sure we're focusing on what's really a problem. And sometimes what we think is the problem based on the information that we have, we may need some more information to really hone in on what we need to focus on. So that's where more screenings and assessments being completed, that's where that's useful. And that may not be needed in all cases. And that goes for everything in all 3 of these tiers. But in many cases, we're looking at gathering more information and more detailed information. And then developing individualized written behavior plans to address social, emotional, and behavioral concerns. So we made sure to include written behavior plans in here, or typed, since we don't really write things out longhand anymore. But we want something in writing so that everybody understands what needs to be happening for a student and what supports they need. We all need to be on the same page. We need to have a well-coordinated effort and intervention plan to address our students' needs, especially at the intensive level. So that written plan is critical at this level. So those are our tier 3 intensive supports for students. And you may be asking yourself about how to access these supports. So it's important to keep in mind that Tier 1, those universal supports, those are available to all students. And we have our teachers are monitoring, our teachers are our teachers and our parents, our families. Those are our greatest sources of referral when it comes to determining if students need additional supports. But if you feel that your child needs more support than they're getting at school, the best thing that you can do is contact your child's principal or school counselor to communicate your concerns. They can then um, meet with you and have a conversation with you, organize a meeting with your child's team, their teachers, counselor, whoever else is important to have on that team to discuss a plan moving forward, to make sure that your child has the appropriate supports available to them in school. And so please reach out to your child's principal or their school counselor if you feel that your child needs more help. And I'm also here as a helper. That's why I got into this profession. I've always enjoyed helping and families, helping students, problem solving. So please feel free to reach out to me, even though you may have never met me before. I'm always here to help and connect people to the correct resources. My information's on this slide. It's on the webpage. Feel free to contact me anytime about anything in this presentation. Also, if you have specific concerns related to your child, I'm happy to help however I can. And I hope this was helpful to you and provided just some more information about what we have available in the district.